And good morning or good afternoon, wherever you might be. I'm Pete Peterson, the very grateful Dean of Pepperdine's Graduate School of Public Policy. Welcoming you here to the last Quest for Community webinar of 2020. I'm delighted to be joined by a great group of local civic leaders, civic communitarians, I'd call them, to talk about what communitarianism looks like in practice. This is the fifth of our Quest for Community webinar series. Over the course of the last few months, we've been exploring a variety of different issues as it relates to taking a more communitarian approach to our policy and politics. One of our webinars has examined the philosophical roots of communitarianism. Another looked at policy challenges and opportunities. Another looked at some of the more historical roots of communitarianism here in the United States. But today, we will look at communitarianism in practice. What does this look like for Americans to engage in their local communities on serious policy issues? And I'm delighted again to be joined by this great group of local leaders. Before I get into the introductions, just a little bit of logistics. This webinar is being hosted by the School of Public Policy here at Pepperdine, based in Malibu, California, and hosted specifically through an initiative called the American Project, which over the course of the last 3+ years, through events, an essay series that we host at the website Real Clear Policy, and other types of engagement, have explored the future for communitarianism in our policy and politics. If you'd like to know more about the work we're doing at the School of Public Policy, and specifically at the American Project, just simply Google American Project at Pepperdine. All of our registrants today, and I believe we have over 100 who've registered for this particular webinar, will be receiving a video link to today's discussion. We are going to begin our conversation shortly and run 15 minutes past 1 o'clock Eastern time, as we have a great panel of discussants here. The agenda for today is that we will begin with 2 or 3 minute introductions by each of our panelists, talk a little bit about their work. Then we'll engage in a conversation for another 35 or 40 minutes or so. And then we're reserving the last 15 or 20 minutes for questions from you all. As we've done throughout this series, questions can be posted in the chat feature. The chat feature you'll see at the bottom of your screen. Just simply click on that. And at any point during our conversation, type in your question and we'll make sure that we get to those in due course. So I wanted to introduce our speakers here, our panelists, for what I'm very excited will be not only an important conversation about how we view our policy and politics, but one that I also believe is going to be inspiring as well. And if 2020 is in need of anything, it is in need of inspiration. So in some ways, this is a little bit of a holiday gift. I hope you will receive it accordingly. First, Evan Feinberg. Evan is the executive director of the Stand Together Foundation. Stand Together supports nonprofit organizations across the country to select social entrepreneurs capable helping people break the cycle of poverty. Prior to joining Stand Together, Feinberg served as president of Generation Opportunity and as a program manager at the Charles Koch Institute. Earlier, Feinberg served as senior aide to U.S. Senators Rand Paul and Tom Coburn, and as a researcher at the Heritage Foundation. He'll talk more about his work at Stand Together just in a minute. Jesús Gerena is CEO of the Family Independence Initiative, or FII, an anti-racist change organization that trusts and invests in low-income families, allowing them to move themselves out of poverty. Under Gerena's leadership, FII has quadrupled its revenue, doubled the staff, and expanded its work to all 50 states through the adoption of its strength-based approach and technology platform up together. And I'm excited to have Jesus speak about his work as well. He's a native of Puerto Rico. Gerena is the youngest of 3 children born to parents who were just 19 years old when they were married. But although his family struggled to make ends meet, they benefited from a support network of extended families and friends. And Jesus is not only leading this work, but he's lived it. And the importance of this community-based approach to our policy and politics is something that we will be exploring in today's conversation. Antong Lucky is the founder and former leader of the Dallas 415 Bloods Gang and is now the head of the Urban Specialist Master Educator and National Engagement Director for OGU, or Original Gangsters University. At an early age, Lucky was embroiled in a life of crime and gang violence and ultimately landed him in prison. Through that experience, Antong denounced his gang affiliation, read a lot, educated himself, and began the work of uniting rival gangs. Most recently, Antong trains police officers on effective community engagement strategies. He's based in Dallas. Antong is a sought-out speaker on issues of eradicating violence, reentry, criminal justice reform, and bridging the gap between law enforcement and community. I'm excited to hear more about his work in reducing violence and engaging people in their community. And finally, Joe Nail. Joe is the CEO and co-founder of Lead for America. LFA works to ensure that every American neighborhood and community has the moral, representative, locally rooted, and long-term committed leadership necessary to address its most critical policy challenges. In just 2.5 years, LFA has grown from a dorm room startup to an organization that has launched the civic leadership careers of more than 600 people in 95 communities nationwide, with revenues of $5 million. LFA has been profiled nationally by outlets, including the Washington Post and NPR, and was awarded fellowships from Summit, Praxis, and the National Geographic. Joe has also lived the experience of community and civic engagement from his own time growing up through his family, with a dad who was an Army civilian contractor and mom a middle school nurse, and look forward again to hearing about his experiences and work. Finally, Scott Strode will be joining us as well, looking at another policy issue of great concern, especially these days. We've talked before about issues related to deaths of despair and the challenges of addiction. And Scott is leading an amazing effort called the Phoenix, a free, sober, active community that helps individuals rise, recover, and live through the power of fitness and community. The Phoenix, like so many of our other panelists today, is based on Strode's own discovery that a healthy lifestyle, active lifestyle, and forming community has a transformative effect on long-term sobriety. In response to the COVID crisis, Strode and his team began offering live-streamed and on-demand classes, which have not only permitted current members to remain connected and prospective members to try out new classes, but has also made it possible for the community supported by the Phoenix to expand globally. Since 2006, the Phoenix has inspired more than 38,000 people across America to believe they have the strength to rise from the ashes of addiction through the support of those who are walking that very same path. And with that, I will bring us all back, welcoming you to this conversation, Communitarianism in Practice. And again, thanks so much to each of you for joining us. I don't usually begin with a visual aid, but I will do so. I'm wondering how many of you, of our guests, may have seen the Wall Street Journal over the weekend, this particular article by columnist Jerry Seib. Far from Washington, Americans are finding solutions. And I thought it was a perfect setup to this conversation today. And I just wanted to read 2 paragraphs before we hear from our panelists. This from the first page. And while national politicians lapsed into finger pointing over shortages of masks and surgical gowns during the pandemic, two businesswomen from Morganton, North Carolina, organized a network of small textile companies in the area to begin producing 500,000 masks and surgical gowns for the region's doctors, hospitals, businesses, and citizens. Quote, in the early days, it was like Rosie the Riveter, says Sarah Chester, one of the businesswomen. Quote, everybody wanted to do their part. There are potentially big lessons in such small steps, writes the columnist Jerry Seib. At a time of deepening national divisions and political tribalism, many Americans have decided to rely less on Washington to deal with the problems and have turned for answers to local institutions, businesses, and their own communities, as well as one another. So I highly recommend this piece from the Saturday's Journal, which is, again, is a perfect setup for today's conversation. So let's bring in our panel. Scott, I want to begin with you. Tell us a little bit about your work through the Phoenix, and again, that tie into a more community-based approach responding to such a great policy and community challenge.
Sure. So I can start with a little bit of my own story. So I'm in long-term recovery from a substance use disorder. And I got sober a little over 23 years ago in a boxing gym here in Boston, and got into the gym and found some other people in recovery who supported me on my journey. They helped me start to believe in myself that I could do anything I put my mind to, including stay in recovery. And that was the beginning of the Phoenix. It just didn't have a name at that time. So years later, I saw this big gap in services where we were still trying to sort of solve the addiction crisis by coming up with a drug to get you off a drug, with a more sweeping sort of top-down solution that really wasn't informed by effective programs on the ground. And we were focusing almost entirely on the acute care model of the 30-day treatment versus how do we help people dream of what's possible in their sober life. And so we saw this opportunity to start the Phoenix to help the country think differently about how to approach this complex issue. So we started in a little over 14 years ago with a handful of people in Colorado, climbing and hiking and biking. And that's grown from 60 people the first year to actually now over 40,000 people have been served by our program. And we fully have a vision of bringing free recovery support to communities across the country, and hopefully changing the way we approach this really complex issue.
Terrific, Scott. Antong, let's come to you in Dallas. Tell us a little bit about your work there in that community.
Thank you, Pete. First of all, I want to say that I too did a little research on communitarianism, and at the root of it, I saw that it was community and civil society, right? And so that's more fitting for the work that we do here in Dallas. Again, I'm Antong Lucky, National Engagement Director and Master Educator for our Urban Specialist OGU product, social entrepreneur, and activist. And let me just tell you about a little bit about the work we do, and I'm gonna give you, following Scott lead, a little bit about me. Over 20 some years ago, maybe 25, 26 years ago, here in Dallas, I founded, started the first blood gang here in Dallas, something that I'm not proud of, but it did happen. And then from there, I ended up going to Penn State, and I graduated with honors. Nobody knew that. Well, not Penn State, actually State Penn. I went to the State Penn here in Dallas. But it was in the state Penn that I met a guy early on in my sentence, an inmate who had been there 15, maybe 20 years prior to me, who approached me on a rec yard one day. And his exact words to me, his name was Willie Fleming, his exact words to me were, he said, "Little brother, I've been watching you in this prison, and all these guys follow everything you do. Whatever you say, they do. They idolize you, they admire you. the whole 9 yards. And he said, in clear language, he said, if you can lead these brothers to do wrong, you have the same ability to lead them to do right. He said, you're a leader. And that was the first time I ever heard those words, that you're a leader. Mm-hmm. And from there, I began to educate myself in prison. I read probably over 500 books, everything from philosophy to religion, comparative religion, everything. And I started to educate myself. I started to bring prisoners together because as I did some introspective reflecting, I was able to pinpoint in my life where things went wrong, how I was able to join a gang and create a gang and get into all of the mischief. I started to pinpoint that stuff. And what I realized was that I had been kind of manipulated into this system. Mm. And so as I began to learn, teach myself and do a lot of reflecting, I began to reach across the aisle to rival gang members who hated my guts. And I began to have conversations with them about the stuff that we had in common. And I found out that we had a lot of stuff in common, that we all was at one point in time good students who loved making good grades, who just had good values. And somewhere along the line, those values got corroded and corrupt. And so we began to work, and I saw on a micro level the camaraderie and the community that we had together. These brothers who probably 5 years later would kill me, we were brothers eating together. And so it was that foundation I began to teach that when I was released from prison, I met Bishop Omar Jawar, my mentor, my spiritual advisor, and my friend. And it was Bishop Omar who showed me how to live practically all the stuff that I learned in prison. It was Bishop Omar that told me that everybody has something to contribute. And he was the first one to tell me that we have a mission to stop violence and a duty to stop violence in our communities. And we began working. So for the last 2 decades, we've been in the area of violence prevention and intervention, making sure that young people have choices, making sure that young people choose college over prison, making sure that this whole idea of being responsible and accountable to your community ring true in urban neighborhoods. And so for the last 2 decades, that's what we've been doing.
Excellent, Antong. Jesus, let's come to you. I know you're in Oakland. Tell us about your work at FII and how it got started.
Sure, yeah. So been with FII now just over 10 years, and the work here began out of a need to really drive at making substantial impact against the issue of poverty and its symptoms. And our founder, Mauricio Lynn Miller, was really frustrated by the traditional top-down, always guessing at the issues. There has to be a silver bullet here, solutions, and came up with a unique approach that we call the strength-based approach, and it's based on 3 key principles. First is community and the value of social networks, social connections. And if you catalyze those and expand for people in relationship, the value of the social capital that comes back to them. Number 2 is that choice, that those who have proximity to the challenges that we're facing actually are developing everyday solutions, similar to the article you found this weekend, to those problems. And we are not recognizing them, let alone investing in them. And that's the third principle here, is direct investment, unrestricted cash or equivalent to those solutions, so that we can catalyze them and hopefully have a wider impact. And so that is running opposite to the prevalent system that exists, which we see as a deficit-based system, one that continuously is thinking about top-down, that is robbing of that agency, as well as penalizing any progress that is happening. And so we're doing all of that through a technology platform called Up Together. And you can visit uptogether.org, where you can see how individuals across the country who are living in poverty can partner with us directly, form small groups through the platform. It's meant to be a tool to complement what's already happening on the ground, as well as to name the goals that they want for themselves, track them, and as they're achieving them, the hope here is that we can bring a light to them and bring more resources and more cash so that they can do more of it. Over the last almost 2 decades that we've been doing this work, over and over again, what we see is that yes, people continue to do, whether it's increasing their income on an average of 21% or increasing their savings, building assets, but the community relationships is what overwhelmingly they continue to point as the bright spot, that all of a sudden they know they don't have to carry this weight alone. It's something that we're continuously sharing to others, which is as you are thinking about these meta problems across the country, there are many people who are finding ways to overcome them. And you don't have to carry that burden alone. You should look at them and invest in them.
That's really good, Jesus. Joe, very interesting program that you had up there, Lead for America. The policy issues can really vary by the communities in which people are working, but tell us a little bit about what inspired Lead for America and a little bit about the work it does.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Pete. And I guess I should start by saying that unlike some of the panelists who've already spoken, I didn't have to, beat the odds or overcome all sorts of different obstacles growing up to be able to get to a place of starting Lead for America. I grew up in a place that had awesome public schools. I had a stable family, 2 loving parents, grew up in a safe neighborhood. And I wish it were different, but unfortunately, I didn't really realize just how fortunate I was until I was 15 years old. And my dad, who you mentioned in the introduction is a civilian contractor for the Army, deployed to Afghanistan for a year. And it was really during that year that I started realizing, again, just how fortunate I was, not just in relation to other children who might be, growing up 10, 15 minutes away in downtown Kansas City. But as I started reading a little bit more about what's going on in the world and kind of the conditions on the ground overseas, close to where my dad was, again, it really kind of dawned on me that there was, significant injustice. And then a much closer to home within my own family. My older brother had just started college, but I'm the middle of 5 kids, and my older sister Katie has a pretty severe intellectual and developmental disability. And that was something that, my own parents had worried that I might have when I was born. And I had seen that while our family was super fortunate in the sense my mom was able to stay home during my dad's time away to help take care of my sister, so many other people, didn't have those same sorts of resources. And so during that year, I really started trying to figure out, what could I do to serve? How could I be of use to the world? I'd never been out of the country. I was really determined to do that after having my dad be overseas. And I was really fortunate to have opportunities through the US government and State Department to go to Indonesia and then for a year to Germany. And this was basically in 2014 and 2015. And I was in Germany at a time that the open door policy was just taking shape. And for those who aren't familiar or who are familiar, just as a refresher, this was basically a decision to accept 1 million plus refugees in a single calendar year into Germany, a country of 80 million people. And people can debate on whether or not that was the right political decision. But what I saw certainly in the rhetoric and the actions of the leaders in that country at the local level and the federal level was doing something based off of moral conviction and moral courage, as opposed to just taking into consideration political factors and recognizing the legacy of their country as being one that had not just discriminated against people who did not meet the ideal vision of a citizen, but had quite literally exterminated people, like my sister Katie, who had disabilities as a prelude to the Holocaust. And so this is all to say that while, I grew up really having a pretty incredibly serene upbringing, I had basically this personal and professional kind of inflection points in my life that led me to think a lot more about how I could be of service, and specifically in public service. And so I got to college, was really dedicated to trying to figure out, what exactly would I be working on, and started to see something really pretty disturbing in and the trends of my peers, which was, here's all these people who wrote their college admissions essays and who dedicated their high school and collegiate careers to trying to be of service to other people. But when push came to shove and they were deciding where they were actually going to go and what they're going to be working on, so many of them were working and moving to the same 3 or 4 cities, New York, Boston, DC, San Francisco, and working in the same kind of narrow career fields. And these were people whose convictions hadn't changed, but who felt like in order to be successful, that required them leaving their communities, leaving their families behind, and again, making a better life for themselves far away in a certain career field. And I certainly, didn't have some sort of grand theory of the world or the universe that was going to figure out how to solve all of our country or our world's big problems. But what I did know is that incredible talent and incredible leadership is born into every community. but the narrative of success in far too many rural and urban communities and even entire states like Kansas, where I grew up, is one where, again, you're told that you have to leave in order to be successful and not come back. It's my belief that in order to get to where we need to be as a country, that we're going to need a leadership force of incredibly moral, dynamic, locally rooted, and representative leaders in every corner of this country. The intention of Lead for America is to try to build that leadership force by equipping communities not to have people parachute in and save the day, but rather to raise up their best local leadership into positions of responsibility. And so just very quickly on our programming, we have an education program for high school and college students that has both a curriculum component where students learn about the big challenges in their community in the classroom, and then competitions and simulations where students are actually proposing real solutions to those challenges in front of the local community leaders with the goal towards having them do internships and other actual projects to start that citizen engagement really early on. And then we have a fellowship program modeled after the Peace Corps Teach for America, where we recruit people from all over the country, 21 to 30 years of age. We give them a month of graduate level public administration and leadership training. And then we place them in their hometown communities for 2-year paid roles that are specifically designed from scratch to be in response to some sort of key issue that the community is facing and that person has lived experience in. So it could be the opioid crisis in West Virginia. It could be housing and homelessness in East Los Angeles and everything in between. And then afterwards, we help them stay in the community, run for office, start a business, start a nonprofit, and hopefully live out that lifelong pathway of civic leadership.
Great, Joe. I look forward to discussing this more. And just a heads up to all of our viewers here, we will be linking in the follow-up email that all of you will be getting with the link to the recording of this session. We'll also be adding links to each of the organizations that are discussed here. I might say, with my dean's cap on, we are nearing year end, and this is a time where people make donation philanthropic decisions. And so I would encourage you all to consider and learn about each of the organizations that we're going to be looking at here. Speaking of philanthropy, I want to bring in Evan Feinberg, who heads up Stand Together. Evan, I think what is interesting about I think one of the themes that we're gathering already here from each of our panelists is that something in their life prepared them for the work that they're doing. And for you, and I want to hear more about it, but it's of interest that you served on staffs for both Senator Rand Paul and the late Senator Tom Coburn, both people who are very well known for their support of civil society, of limited government, but with expanded citizenship being that necessary response. Tell us a little bit about your work at Stand Together and what brought you there.
Well, I think my own journey from the world of public policy and running for office myself to the work that I do today is, I think, indicative of the journey that we have to go on together to really understand the American project. And I love that title for this series. And I was struck when I heard you say it today that we have to do some work to define what exactly the American project is, because for a lot of folks that have worked in public policy, we instantly go to checks and balances in government and the role of the state versus the federal government and constitutionally limited government as sort of like the American project. But to me, that's not the American project. The American project is a dedication to a certain set of principles that all people are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. And among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And those principles are not just meant to be principles that guide how we govern ourselves from a rules standpoint, from a public policy standpoint, but they actually ask us to rethink humanity, the dignity of individuals, and how we live and work well together to drive the most human flourishing. And when I think about, say, Alexis de Tocqueville coming to America to comment on this new project, this American project, he didn't comment on the incredible elected officials and leaders, or even the genius of the way that we designed our public institutions. He commented on the American project as individuals who were constantly coming together in common cause to solve big problems and small problems in genius and dynamic ways all over the country all the time. So I guess my point is that what I've learned throughout my career and what I learn every day at Stand Together Foundation, I get to work with most of the other panelists on this call. I've learned that the best examples of the American project are not coming. We don't hear them from the halls of Congress. You see them in the incredible leaders that are on this call and the work that they do all the time. You mentioned that Wall Street Journal article. I pulled out a couple quotes. I hadn't read it yet, but hearing you read from it. Everyone wanted to do their part, right? This is a very, an author named Dick Cornell, who's one of my heroes. He writes about it that we all have this motivation, this service motive we find meaning and purpose by helping others to improve their lives. And, we find this motivation always and everywhere across the country. I think it's the most powerful force in America today. How do we unlock the mutual benefit of people that want to love and serve one another and help their communities to improve to the best potential opportunities to do it? And, we can go a whole lot further into this, but I'll stop here by saying, Dick Cornell talks about the problem being we nationalized community, right? So over time, we began to think that there were problems so big that only an entity as big as the government could solve it, which is so silly to me. You think about the problem of feeding 330 million Americans every single day, 3 square meals a day, or whatever it is they do. We don't think of that being such a big problem. Philanthropy must demonstrate solutions so that some government bureaucrat can adopt it and roll out the national feeding plan. Instead, we try to galvanize people finding ingenious and simple and wonderful new ways to feed one another and to feed themselves every single day. And it doesn't happen as individuals, it happens in communities. It happens with businesses and nonprofits and informal association. And so to me, this is the American project. How do we unlock the ingenuity and spirit of the average American person and community to love and serve one another in dynamic ways? And I get to see it every day. At Stand Together Foundation, we invest in social entrepreneurs that are helping people tap into their gifts and talents to contribute and in the process to live more meaningful and purposeful lives. And so we get to see this each and every day in the work that we do.
Excellent, Evan. And I do want to explore the influence of Cornell. The title of this series is The Quest for Community, and it's derived from the title of American sociologist Robert Nisbet's, I think, foundational work. Tocqueville is certainly a major part of this conversation as well. I think what's so fascinating about the conversations that we've been able to host over these last few months is that this communitarian approach is at once philosophical, historical, very much policy related, but very much having an impact on the ground, which really obviously is the focus for this. But I do want to get into talking a little bit more about Cornell's work as well. Scott, I want to do just a time check or an agenda check here. I'm going to come back to each of you with questions based on the work that you're doing in your introductory remarks. And I want to make sure, again, that all of our audience knows that they can be entering questions via the chat feature. We'll make sure that we get to those in time. Scott, one of the things that you've helped me to understand as it relates to the work that you do in responding to addiction is the importance of community and community-based solutions. Your work currently in Boston as well as Colorado is obviously not taking a national approach, and you're not in every city, but you're in a lot of different places. So tell us a little bit about why connection is so important in the work you do, and why grounding it in particular kind of hubs or communities is so important.
Sure. So, I mean, I can start a little bit from, once again, from my own experience. When I was in the darkest part of my addiction story, the sort of failures that came up as a result of that and the shame that I carried continued to drive me further and further into my addiction. And for me, I was a survivor of sort of early childhood trauma, and a lot of what that trauma taught me was also, perpetuated my substance use. And what I really needed is a place where I could be sort of accepted and loved for all the parts of me, even the tough ones.
Mm.
And so at the Phoenix, our program is free. You only have to be 48 hours clean and sober to come to our program, but you do have to adhere to a code of conduct, which is designed to create a nurturing environment. And the idea is, if all these adverse experiences that so many of us have in our life journey, if we can create the opposite, we can actually create this nurturing place where we help each other dream of what's possible in our new sober life. And so those were the key sort of underpinnings of our program. And, I think oftentimes when we think of these issues, we think of them as almost like in a philosophical way, but how we put them into action, it is hard to imagine that you could create a nurturing environment to take millions of folks in recovery from addiction, up to the top of a mountain so they can find their self-efficacy and heal self-esteem. But that's exactly what we're trying to do at the Phoenix, and we're well on the way to do that. But it takes coming alongside organizations like Stand Together and Evan to do that. But just as an example, when we first met Stand Together, we were in 7 communities in 3 states with our program, and we're now in 24 states and 50 communities across the country. But we didn't do it just through like a real expensive brick and mortar scaling of our program that would never be able to help us reach the whole country. We actually opened up an opportunity for volunteers to raise their hand, people who've been touched by this in their own communities across the country. And we thought we'd have a half dozen or a couple dozen folks apply to become Phoenix sites. We had over 700. And we started having the conversation, what if we could turn that into 7,000? We could serve 1 million people with free recovery support. So that's what launched us off on this goal.
Just a quick follow-up. Tell us how you did that outreach to find those locally based community leaders.
We started to attack the stigma around this issue. This is a thing that we often keep in sort of a shame place, maybe in a family of origin story or with a loved one who's struggling. But we wear t-shirts that say sober. We wear our Phoenix gear at the triathlon we're racing. We wear it at the CrossFit competition we're going to, or the yoga class in the park that we're teaching. So folks come to those activities, they see people model that there's actually a pride in who I am today in my recovery, not a shame of who I was in my addiction. And that allows the story to reach more people who are struggling. And I honestly believe that we're looking for solutions to the why behind issues, not just the treatment of the symptoms of an issue. And so, the idea of a drug to get you off a drug, or how to get overdose reversal drugs out more quickly, we need to do that stuff to save lives. But in that isn't the solution to the core problem. If we can go to that core problem, we can actually interrupt the generational transmission of it to the next, to our kids. So I think people hear that kind of message and they're inspired alongside it because it sounds different, it feels different. And I think hope is really the log on the fire that will keep us warm over time, as opposed to the treating the symptoms as the flash paper that as soon as it burns, we need more of it to warm ourselves again.
Very well said. Jesus, I want to come to you. You mentioned the term social capital. That's a term that we've used in a number of our events at the American Project. I think sometimes when those who have at least heard of the term communitarianism, they think about it in purely philosophical terms, but there really is a policy aspect to it. There's an economic aspect to it. Tell us how you understand the importance of social capital and why your community-based approach is so important in promoting and supporting more social capital.
Yeah, thank you. A couple of things. So first is that, and I always think about my own journey and sort of continuing to make investments into my household, whether it's to buy a house or make improvements on that house, think about my retirement, whatever the case may be, the first people I go to are my close friends and the folks who have already gone through that process, and have them sharing their experience, as well as if they've had success with a certain institution or entity that could really support my own goals in doing so, they can provide a connection, right? And that is really meaningful, and maybe overcoming that first challenge of fear as to what meaning to reach out to a real estate agent is, or a banking institution that could really walk me through getting a mortgage or a refinance, for that matter. And my experience is not unique. I am sure that you all are thinking about your own lives and doing the same, as well as the audience. And so I think oftentimes what happens when we think about challenges that are facing community, we don't think about the way that we overcome challenges or meet opportunities in our lives, which is exactly as I explained, right? It's always thinking and looking at people who know the issue and can provide expertise and possibly a connection. I think that the other one too that I would mention, LinkedIn does a great job of helping you expand your professional network and potentially then getting a connection to the job that you want. And it's something like 70% greater chance of you getting that job if you have that one connection to be able to open the door. And that can mean the difference between making minimum wage and getting a $20 to $30 an hour job as a result of it. And so those personal connections and thinking and analyzing for yourself how you can then make strides becomes really critical. And I'll just share a quick story of a woman that we worked with in Boston who had 3 kids, lived in public housing, and really shifted her mindset as to how to make improvements in her lives, and went back to college, took on an extra job to be able to do these things. And she lived next to a neighbor for 10 years in this housing development, and they never really talked. And one day she was folding her college sweater in the laundromat, and the woman, her neighbor, was there, and she just said, "How did you get there? How did you get into being able to purchase that sweater for yourself and go back to school?" And so, right, it was the inspiration of her actions, that even though they weren't close, and that modeling that happens, that all of a sudden, like, it clicks something on her that maybe I can do that the same, right?
Yeah.
And that sort of motivation, as well as then the connections that Isabel had to be able to potentially connect her to a scholarship and walk her through the application process, make it real, is the value of that social capital. And I think over and over again, as the challenges continue to mound, that process of, we've been so well trained in vilifying these communities as the problem. When the truth is, again, that in spite of all these challenges that we're facing, they provide solutions every single day. And so if you begin with that mindset, instead of looking at what are the gaps of what's missing or the enormity of that, you can start changing your own habits and helping change the habits of others. It works exactly the same way on both sides.
What you say reminds me of another great communitarian, and somebody I think also exemplifies one of the other things that I'm really excited about as it relates to this work, is that it's non-ideological, right? This cuts, I have no idea how you all vote, and I frankly don't care. But I think about John McKnight's work around asset-based community development, the ABCD work that he's done for decades out of Chicago and Northwestern, and that asset-based approach, which is another way of saying, and you used this phrase before, which I think is great, Jesus, the abundance mindset as opposed to a deficit mindset. What are the talent, skills, and abilities that are already in the community that we need to not only develop but connect one to another? That's excellent. Really excited. Antong, I want to come to you. One of the things in an earlier conversation in your work in Dallas and beyond, in responding to violence, has been your mission to, I wrote this quotation down, to take ownership of your community. I'm interested to hear a little bit more about how you define that, how you understand taking ownership of the community, and why that kind of geographic focus in the work you do is really so important.
Well, I think for us, Bishop Omar, one of the things that he told me when I first met him, it's kind of like a guiding thought was, no matter what happens to you, you're responsible for what you do for you. And just kind of having that as a framework, we do understand that, especially in the communities that we serve, urban communities, when you look at you have single parents, you have fathers who are out of the household. Even this morning, I was discussing with my editor about the 1994 crime bill that disproportionately removes Black men from the community, right? And so that was 24 years ago. And so you had these young people growing up without the presence of a father, no direction whatsoever. Bishop Omar taught us that once we change our character, our characteristics have a marked advantage. Right now, violence is something that a lot of communities that are grappling with across the nation. And what we understand is proximity. Those individuals who are in the community, who live in those communities that are closer to the young people, they control the rhythm of neighborhoods. They control the violence in the neighborhood. And so it is our belief that when you are able to change those individuals who are closer to young people, they can change a community. So our whole focus has been finding those individuals who are in those communities, who carry the essence of that community, and teaching them the responsibility of not only just eradicating violence, but the importance of being surrogate fathers and mothers, mentors to these young people who are growing up without a strong, positive male role model in their lives. And so when you look at that, that's important, because it's better to have those individuals in the community, as Jesus said, who are closer to the community, taking ownership of their own community than having a top-down approach, someone coming in saying, this is how it goes, this is how it should be. That's different. These individuals, what we're finding is these individuals, it's a reimagining, it's a different mental model. Because again, one of the things that Bishop said, that Black men from the ages of 18 to 30 are often underutilized. They are removed. They're looked at as the problem. We're changing the mental model. We're saying to these guys that you are the solution, that you have an advantage, you have influence to go back into your community. And that's a different kind of mindset. And it's not a mindset where we blaming the system, we blaming institution. We're not saying that it's white people. We're not doing that. We're not saying that. We're saying take accountability of your own community. That's your community. Stay in your community, help your community. You have an advantage in your community. And that's the message that we kind of implore with the individuals that we serve.
That's awesome, Antong. And it's a great segue into your work, Joe. Obviously it's the mission of Lead for America that you are, in fact, I believe you call them hometown fellows in your program that are serving these 2-year hitches of support. And I think one of the interesting things that you've talked about through your work at Lead for America, and I want to make sure I get this quotation right, is that you want to change the definition of what success means. In your earlier comments, you mentioned that so many of the models around so-called success mean or demand culturally that people leave their hometowns, whether it's very rural or very urban. Tell us a little bit about why that changing that mindset is so important.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that just building on Antong's point, it's a really good thing if relative to maybe falling into poor circumstances around you, if you focus on just getting yourself to a better place. And I don't think any one person can have the ability to be able to help other people without first having gotten themselves to a place where they're able to be in control and lead their own lives. But that being said, I think the kind of next step of aspiration or success should really be focusing on, okay, it's one thing to be able to get yourself unstuck, but it's another thing to actually focus on bringing your community or your neighborhood or whatever your local unit of organization is along with you. And I mentioned this earlier, but our belief is that again, every single neighborhood, every single community has incredible people and incredible talent. And that's not just defined as, the person who's out front being elected to office. We're talking about, people who are just doing all the unhistoric acts, the things that history books may not record that make a community or a neighborhood thrive and grow. And yet, what we've done as a society is we have placed at the pinnacle people operating at the national level of fame and power. And certainly those roles are important. But what I think it does is a couple of things. One, it commodifies and it nationalizes and it unsuccessfully has institutionalized connection and relationship and community. And in addition to that, it's actually, again, depleting our communities of their most valuable natural resource, which is, again, the people who are going to be focused, again, on bringing their neighbors and friends and community members along with them to just a better life. And so with our organization, again, it's not ideological. We're deliberately nonpartisan, and it's not about presupposing specific solutions to any one problem. It's just echoing what other panelists have said, a recognition that we have incredible challenges at any community or any neighborhood level. The work of community is not something that you arrive at, but it's rather something that you're constantly working at. And the only way that we're going to be successful is not just building pathways, but actually making sure that at a wholesale level that we're changing that narrative so that people who may never hear about Lead for America or even know anything about what we're doing will still be able to benefit and buy into that. And more importantly, that the legacy of what we're building is going to live in the actions and the archetypes and the examples that we're holding up and in how they treat the people around them, as opposed to again just propping up our organization as yet another group that is there to save the day.
We are seeing some very vibrant engagement here in the chat, and I again welcome questions and comments. Harry Boyd is with us, who's just an incredible career in this work about building and preparing community leaders. I'm excited to be thinking about with Harry some of the work we're going to do together in 2021 around the American Project. I hope these models are serving to provide examples to you, Harry. Not that you're unfamiliar with these, but just really exciting to see these programs around preparing community leaders, and goes back to your point, Antong, about the importance of people understanding themselves to be leaders. You mentioned that point in the yard where somebody called you a leader. And to me, that's another way of calling someone a citizen, right? Which is, and I mean this in the truly philosophical sense, that it's somebody with agency and someone that can engage and respond to issues that affect them and their community. What's your thinking, Antong, on the importance of how we think about ourselves as leaders and how you do that in your work?
Yeah, I think it's pretty much what Evan said in his intro. When you are when you're getting people to understand what they have to offer, oftentimes in our work, the people that we deal with, just as I were 20-some years ago, I didn't see myself as a leader. I didn't see the potential that I had. And Willie Fleming pointed that out into me. It woke something up in me. And you have to think, when we look at our communities, I can only speak for the communities that I work in and day out. When you've seen this narrative, and this kind of going off script again, when you've seen this narrative that's been disproportionately on nightly news of the criminality of Black men replayed over and over and over and over again, and the intersectionality of that, you have to agree that, surmise that people feel as though they're not leaders, that they don't have nothing to offer. And so I think with our message, showing people community, showing how they can become effective, telling them that they're leaders and they have influence, changing that paradigm in their mind unlocks this potential. And I think the work that we're doing, when you look at the cracks in the floor of American community, American culture.
Very good.
We are patching that work. We are patching those cracks up by taking these individuals who are oftentimes are looked at as the issue and saying, you have a role to play in your community, that we're going to give you responsibility. We're going to make you accountable. And we're not going to allow you to soothe and victimhood. We're not going to allow you to be a victim. We're not going to allow you to play the blame game. We're saying no matter what happens to you, you're responsible for what you do for you. And that's the mentality and the mindset that we're having in our communities. And Peter, just going a little bit further, never did I think when I was denouncing the gang, this gang tribalism mentality in prison, that 20-some years later, that I'll be working in the field of helping police officers engage with community, and community engaging with police officers, and Democrat versus Republican, liberal versus conservative. It's that same tribalism mentality that I denounced in a prison cell 20-some years ago. It prepared me for this work. So I said to myself, if I could walk across the aisle and deal with an individual who is my enemy, who by all means, we were rivals, gang members trying to kill each other, and make peace and find that commonality and say, how do we better our communities? Then it's no challenge that I'm not up for when it comes to trying to patch these holes up in our culture.
Well, you are preaching, Antong, and I'm sure I'm not the first person to say that, but just to acknowledge Candace and Cheryl's very encouraging remarks of that. In some ways, and Evan, I want to come to you to think about the approach from philanthropy, but also I don't want to lose the thread of Cornell's work because I think he is someone, along with Nisbet, that people need to know more about, because in many ways it provides a real grounding to this work. We're not expecting enough of each other. When I hear what you're saying, Antong, actually, when we take this top-down approach, whether it's government or kind of a large nonprofit organization that may see the people they serve more as clients as opposed to real agents and leaders of change, we're actually going to be demanding more of each other if this mindset is to take hold than less. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you think at Stand Together about this work in that in some ways philanthropy is seen as kind of giving a handout to organizations, but really this is about investing in organizations that are demanding quite a bit of people to make positive change in their communities.
Yeah, well, if you were to look at how the prevailing approaches, it doesn't matter, as you said, whether it's philanthropy or government. And this is a group of mostly public policy researchers or folks thinking about the role of government in society, I would imagine. The classic sort of temptation is to research a problem and then develop the very best solutions to that problem. But no research would ever naturally uncover the fact that Scott Strode, who's experienced with addiction, and the sort of ingenious approach that he took to help himself and his community and now 40,000 people to overcome addiction, would be the sort of evidence-based best practice. And if you did that, you'd ruin it. If you said, hey, the clinical approach to solving addiction would be to get people together in groups to work out together, because you'd lose the magic of the culture of the Phoenix and how it inspires this hope and belief and resilience of individuals. Or if you were to say that evidence-based best practice on how to reduce gang violence would be to go find a former leader of the Blood Gang in Dallas and equip him to be a trainer of other, current and former gang leaders, you wouldn't naturally come to that. And if you turn that into an evidence-based best practice, you'd ruin it because you'd lose all the magic of what Antong and his team have done. And so what we need is a reframe of what's needed in the social sector. We don't need sort of philanthropy or private activity to be the alternative to government activity, though I think that would be a good thing. What we need is a paradigm shift, that we need dynamic social entrepreneurship and discover anew each and every day how we create value for one another. How do we equip each other to realize our full potential? And so what we need is constantly to, first of all, to have a deep belief in people, to believe that whomever we're in community with or seek to be in community with have innate and extraordinary potential to contribute and realize just a far greater potential for their life. So just start with that deep belief. And then we have to believe that the only way we're going to accomplish that is through bottom-up solutions, right? In a world that mostly is filled with top-down approaches, well-intentioned top-down approaches. Yeah. So that to me is the role of today. Most philanthropy looks just like government. Study the problem, find the very best solutions, fund it, rather than invest in social entrepreneurship that's discovering what could work. We believe the goal is to treat poverty and problems in communities as an innovation problem rather than a resource problem. We're not trying to meet a need. We're trying to find and discover new ways to help everybody to live better lives, because when we help others to live better lives, we also do. We find more meaning, purpose, and as they contribute their gifts, we're all better off for it.
You know, Antong is going multimedia on us here, entering the chat room, which I appreciate that. I love that phrase, though. When we approach this work, we must look for problems that are solvable versus problems that are fundable. The ills of society are solvable. And that's a perspective not just held by philanthropy, but obviously also by government. So in this last round of questions, and I'm going to try to weave in some of the good questions from the audience, a time check, we're going to go to 1/4 the hour for this. And again, if you need to hop off, totally understand. Everyone who is registered will be getting a link to this recording along with links to each one of the organizations. And I believe we'll also include a couple book links that might be of things that have been referenced in this conversation. My last pass through is going to be this policy conversation around challenges that you have faced from top-down organizations in the work that you do, whether that's governmental in policy or even, dare I say, being big-footed by much larger nonprofits that may come into a space. I'm very interested. We had a separate webinar just on a policy platform for communitarianism, but would love to hear from you all individually about any challenges, and this can be, really as a, whoever has experienced it, challenges that you've faced from policy organizations in trying to do the work you're doing at the community level. And maybe as a way to start it, Scott, I remember in our prep call, you noted some of the challenges around policies related to addiction and criminalization. Tell us a little bit about challenges that you have faced from policymakers hampering the work that you've done.
Sure. And this will address a question that was asked in the chat too, because, one reason we sort of are where we are in our current sort of addiction crisis, if you want to say that, I refer to it as a pandemic within the pandemic. In 40 states, we've seen an increase in opioid fatalities. And I think by the end of the year, we'll probably lose 75,000 Americans to overdose underneath what's happening with COVID-19. And I think the war on drugs and some of the stuff that Antong spoke about, really have kind of got us to where we are. And I think there's whole, I'd say Black and brown Americans struggling with substance use disorder have disproportionately been incarcerated for their addiction and their trauma, as opposed to sent to, a cliffside treatment center somewhere. And so I think we see a lot of resources, we're a little confused, I think, on where we're spending the bulk of our funding in the top-down approaches. What I've seen is, say, medication-assisted treatment, which is crucial for folks coming off of opioids, but it's a synthetic opioid essentially. Is something that can be life-saving, but isn't a destination. You don't stop there. It's a stepping stone to a rich, full life in recovery. But I've seen, the sort of the funding coming out of DC focus so much on MAT, medication-assisted treatment, that a lot of the detox programs, which were crucial in our communities to be that first step into recovery, shift their focus of work because they followed the dollar. And so we lost detox programs in our communities, and now folks are forced to detox on a friend's sofa, or they're really lost a lot of those resources. And it kind of, to me, feels like overturning the wheel to get back on the road, but you end up going off the other side of the road. Whereas if we could just listen, and I keep saying this throughout this call, but if we could listen to what the symptoms of the issue are telling us, somewhere underneath that we can find the solution, because we'll get to the root cause. So I think just understanding that some of the despair we're seeing around the addiction crisis is actually a signal of a deeper pain that I think we're feeling across the country. We could actually focus on healing that from within communities. I think when you find that sense of citizenship and belonging, you start to Anton's point again, one of our Phoenix participants said that Phoenix didn't make me strong, it just reminded me that I am. And I think that strength is within all of us. And if we can activate that at the community level, we can help heal the problem from where we stand.
Jesus, I want to come to you on this as well. Obviously, your work around poverty, there are numerous organizations and certainly local through federal governments that are engaged in this as well. What challenges have you seen, either in policy or organizationally, to doing the kind of work that you're doing that's both community-based, but also with that second C of choice, requires a certain degree of agency and engagement?
Yeah, I would point to a couple of things. First is, and going back to Antong's point about the narrative that has to change both in the policy government level, but then also among ourselves and those who are sort of experiencing, or those who are experiencing the issue of poverty. And that starts with what are we learning, and really lifting a strength-based approach data as much as possible, and building that asset-based data to be as robust as the deficit-based. That really can inform then policy, as well as for those individuals who continuously hear the narrative that is being shared about who they are and what their lives are like. It will begin to change because you'll be able to talk about the good that is happening rather than just always the bad. That's one piece. I think that the other is that, because we've villainized those who are facing many of these problems and challenges, that means that as they do better, we do less for them. We disinvest in them. We penalize that progress that they're making. And I share this stat all the time that 2017 being the latest census studies that showed of the 40 million Americans that are below poverty within a 4-year period of time, 75% will move above that poverty line. That's incredible, right? Like, in spite of everything that we're talking about and all these challenges, people are still determined to do better. And if we begin to build and understand what that better is, and let alone invest in it, I think that would fundamentally begin to have a widespread a catalytic effect to really begin to support that mobility long term. So those are, like, I would say, two really clear things. I think that the last is, as much as folks want to help, um, as we partner with Stand Together Foundation and know as well, is we ask them to stop doing that. Stop trying to help. People are more than capable of figuring this out in all sorts of ways. And what that forces, I think, for anybody interested in this impact-driven work is to listen and pay attention and understand
That's
from
what
those
Scott just said.
individuals
Yeah.
directly.
Yeah.
And I think if you're doing all of those things, it will change you, right? Like, you cannot be affected by the stories that you're hearing here, but are only a small sample of what we know is happening every day.
Antong, I want to come to you. Obviously, working on issues of violence and crime, there's a whole set of local, state, federal policies and organizations responding to this. Tell us a little bit about what policy challenges you see.
I want to go specifically to an incident that deals with policy. And I go back to when we were working inside of the local school district. One of the things that we knew, dealing with gangs and the violence, is that the school became the place that they met up and acted out the violence. And so genius as Bishop Omar was, he negotiated with the principal to allow some of our guys to go into the school and monitor the peace. Prior to us going in, the school recorded 482 gang incidents the previous year. 2 years after our guys and girls were there, it reduced to only two incidents.
Wow.
Right. And so with those numbers, the attendance went up, the scores went up, enrollment into extracurriculum activity went up, because kids could now not be threatened by gangs, because you had these older guys and women monitoring, walking the halls, making sure that there was no gang incidents, no problem, that kids could focus on their academics. Okay, so we reduced it to 2. The following year, the superintendent called us in to fill out our contract. And right when he handed us the contract, he said, you can sign this contract today, but you can no longer use the guys that you use, because some of our guys had background issues. And so that was a policy issue that we had to then change the way we operated, because we couldn't, because that policy said that they couldn't. And then I'll take us to another example when Bishop and Omar and I was speaking in Congress, and a lady, I remember this lady, she was old, her head was fully white, old lady. She said, so are you telling me that you guys are gonna have felons working with kids? Although the disclaimer is we don't deal with people who have crimes of sexual moral turpitude, anything like that. And I remember Bishop responding saying, with all due respect, ma'am, it was probably felons who made these kids. And so it just highlight the kind of challenges policy-wise that we've run up against in terms of trying to be effective and making sure kids are safe, making sure kids are doing what they have to do. So it's and so we've been trying to challenge that, and based upon the results, all about getting the right kind of results and not just looking at it from the perspective. It's a mental model change. We have to change the way we look at it. We have to change and look for individuals who can have the results that we need to make our community better.
Antong, I love what you said earlier, and we'll close on this as we're at time. And thank you so much, not only for this time, but all the work that each of you are doing. It really does demonstrate and exemplify the work that we're trying to promote here at the American Project based at the Policy School. I see the co-director of the project, Rich Taffel, is on, and I'm sure that he is just super happy to see a panel like this, because it really is a demonstration of the principles that we've been promoting here. Your phrase there, the work we all do, Antong, is an exemplar of the patriotic devotion to the common good that Putnam talks about. And that's what this is about, right? I mean, we talk so much about government role or even large nonprofit role. We don't talk about citizen agency and even understanding citizen in that sense. We talk about it from a legal standpoint. We talk about it as it relates to voting and rights, but we don't do enough talking about responsibilities. And the work that you're doing is actually preparing citizens, really. I mean, people who are leading in their communities to respond to issues that need responding to. And so just very grateful to each of you for this time. Again, for all of our viewers, and so many of you stayed on through the top of the hour, very grateful for you. And I know, again, we had well over 100 registrants for this, so we'll be passing this around. We encourage you to forward it because that's how this work continues to increase and grow, is you take a video of a conversation like this, which I hope you've found to be very inspiring, and you send it around to others to say, and as much as we are facing so many challenges, many historic, so much polarization, there's hope. There's hope in people that are engaged and involved in their communities to build them, and in some cases, rebuild them. And so in some ways, again, I think this is a little holiday present that you can send around to people in your network. So again, thanks so much for your time. We're very excited about our plans for the American Project as we head into 2021. And we'll be in touch with all of you as we continue this work to support and promote a more communitarian approach to our politics and policy. So God bless you all. Thanks so much from Pepperdine and the School of Public Policy. Have a wonderful holiday season and a wonderful new year. Look forward to seeing you on the other side. Thanks so much all.
Thank